All right, everybody, I want to welcome you to our Thursday night conversations with Commodores. And I'm so happy to have my friend, Huntsville attorney Kenny Cole, with us this evening. Good evening, Kenny. Hope you're doing well.
Doing well, Bernard. Thank you for having me on here.
Absolutely. And guys, as we've been doing for about 20 weeks now, we're going to continue to do it. I'm going to keep having these conversations with Commodores, whether they were football players, cheerleaders, coaches, trainers, managers, support staff, whatever it is. And it's been a lot of fun for me. So I want to thank everybody who's participated, who's been on the conversations, and all the awesome comments. These trips down memory lanes. And Kenny, one of the beautiful things that's been, and you and I have talked about this recently, is that it doesn't just span the years that you were a Commodore for the guests. It's all different generations. We've got Commodores who played in the late 60s all the way to Commodores who've played in this past decade are commenting, and it's been a lot of fun, a lot of camaraderie. So thank you for joining me tonight.
Well, absolutely. And Bernard, let me just say this too, because I want everybody to know how I feel. And I think I speak on behalf of a lot of other folks when I say this. Thank you for doing this, because I think it's important to all of us to be able to, not only reconnect with some of the folks that we played with, but to build relationships with other folks that may have come from, different generations at Vanderbilt. So, I think it's really important what you're doing, and I appreciate you going to all of this trouble. So thank you.
Oh, my pleasure. We're going to, like I said, we're going to keep doing this. This is a labor of love for me. I love to talk, and I'm starting to listen a little bit more, so that's a good thing. For those of you who don't know Kenny played linebacker for the Commodores in the late 70s, hailing out of Decatur, Alabama. And I'm going to pause right there. I'm going to let Kenny tell you guys a little bit about where he is now and a little bit more about his practice, his family, and get caught up to the present time. And then we'll throw it back to Decatur and getting recruited and all that good stuff.
Okay. Well, I'm living in Huntsville, Alabama now, and I'm a trial attorney in terms of my profession. I've been a lawyer since 1984, graduated from Vanderbilt Law School. And so the cases that I handle are all civil cases. In other words, not the criminal matters, just civil matters. And I guess the best way to describe it would be to say that I'm what you call a civil prosecutor. I bring cases to enforce the civil laws. So it can be anything from, your general run-of-the-mill personal injury type cases. Somebody has a collision at an intersection, or it can be something where, it's a bit more complicated, like a dangerous product that has to be redesigned. We're trying to force a company to, make their products in a safer way. Or it can involve, environmental hazards, people that, have dumped a whole bunch of chemicals into the water supplies or things of that nature. So basically anything where either an individual or a company has been injured by somebody else's wrongful conduct. And I represent the folks that have been injured.
Well, and I know Kenny professionally. We belong to a couple different organizations together, and I really appreciate and applaud all the work that you and your firm do in the north part of the state and other parts of the state as well, but you're based out of Huntsville. And guys, if you don't know Kenny from back in the day, you really ought to read up on this guy. He was at Vanderbilt from 77 to maybe 1980 for those the seasons.
Yeah, through that 1980 season.
And they allowed you to graduate in 81, I think.
Yep, they did. They were glad to get rid of me.
Well, let's go back before that, Kenny, and take us to Decatur. And coming out of high school in Decatur, did you play multiple sports, or was football just your sport, or what got your interest as a high school kid?
Well, Decatur is my hometown, as you mentioned, but I grew up as an Army brat. Mm-hmm. And so I was born at Fort Benning, Georgia, and my dad was in the Army. We moved all over the place as I was growing up. And in 1973, he retired from the Army at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. And we were going to move back to Alabama. My dad was from Birmingham. My mom was from Bruton. Bruton was too small. Birmingham was too big. They wanted something in the middle, and they wanted it to be close to an Army base. And so Decatur was in the middle in terms of size and was close to Redstone Arsenal. And when we were moving from North Carolina, I had told my mom and dad that when I went into the 9th grade, that I wanted to perhaps try to play football. I had not played it before. And so my dad was talking to a cousin of his in Alabama about where's one of the best high school football programs. And the head coach at Decatur High School was a guy named Earl Webb, and he was the Bear Bryant of high school football back in those days. And so that's why we ended up looking at Decatur. It met all the criteria, and we ended up moving to Decatur in the summer of 1973. So I went all 4 years of high school there in Decatur, which was something that my older sisters never got to do because we were moving around so much.
When you started, was Decatur, did it begin in 9th grade or was it a 10th grade starting grade?
I started high school in the 9th grade at Decatur High School. And so as 9th graders, we played on the freshman team. And, I was a decent sized kid for back then. I was probably 5'11" and about 165 pounds maybe as a freshman. And so I played that freshman year. It was the first year I'd ever played. So I was kind of new at the game and didn't really know what I was doing. But I did well enough as a freshman that at the end of the freshman season, the varsity was still playing games. They had about 3 more ball games to play. And so they sent me up to the varsity end and let me practice with the older guys. Of course, I didn't get a chance to play in any of the games as a freshman, but got a chance to practice with the bigger and older, more knowledgeable guys. And so that was a little scary, but it was a good learning experience.
I was going to say, I bet that was a great experience for you. At 5'11", you may have been a little taller than most 9th graders, but getting that experience was invaluable. At what point in your high school career did you, or maybe even before this, when was it that you thought, hey, I think I want to play after high school. I think that I want to play in college somewhere?
Well, when I was living over in North Carolina, back then they called it junior high school instead of middle school. So at the junior high school I was at in North Carolina, they had a football team and they had a baseball team. And at that point in time in North Carolina, I was more interested in baseball. And so I played on the baseball team over in North Carolina. And it wasn't really until my 8th grade year in that spring before we were going to move back home to Alabama that I actually started getting interested in football. I'd never really had an interest in it prior to that, but I started, watching more games, college games on TV and things of that nature during my 8th grade year. And so, as we were reaching that point where I was going to be getting out of 8th grade, and of course we knew that my dad was going to be retiring and we would be moving back to Alabama. That's when I went to my parents and said, hey, I think when we get over to Alabama, I'd like to give football a shot and see if I like it.
Well, clearly in hindsight, it ended up working out okay for you. But did you stay? I know that Decatur is a bigger school, but what classification was Decatur at the time you were coming through?
Well, at that point in time, the Alabama was broken down into 1A through 4A. So Decatur was a 4A school. So we were, playing all the big teams in Alabama in terms of our region play. Some of the other teams that we would play were 3A teams like Athens High School. But my senior year at Decatur, the last high school football game I played actually was against Mountain Brook out of Birmingham. And they had a little old running back by the name of Major Ogilvy. Playing. I had bumped our heads a few times during that game.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you're playing linebacker and he's playing, I guess, fullback or running back at that time, I suspect y'all met up in a couple of those holes in the line a few times.
And actually, I was going to tell you that you mentioned playing linebacker. I was in high school. I was actually playing noseman.
Really?
And so I was on the defensive line. And at that point in time, when I was a senior in high school, I was 6'2", weighed 185 pounds, and played nose man.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was pretty small. The Super All-State team in Alabama that year, the defensive linemen were me at 185 pounds, and Frank Warren and Byron Bragg at 265. And so,
and for those of you who don't know who they were, one went to Alabama and the other went to Auburn. And
yeah,
but for 6'2", that's a tall nose tackle or nose guard type player. But I guess you grew about 3 inches during your high school years.
I did.
Did you ever play linebacker in high school, or were you strictly on the line during that time?
No, I never did. But I was pretty quick off the ball. And Coach Dave Noose was the linebacker coach at Vanderbilt. And he came down and started recruiting me. And he said, you know, Kenny, I want to recruit you to play linebacker. He said, all you're going to have to do is just stand up and take 3 steps backwards, and we're going to make a middle linebacker out of it. And I didn't know if I could do that or not, but, you know, I was all interested in it. I'd gone through high school, and I didn't know if I was going to get a chance to play at the next level. I was not one of those guys who thought, you know, my whole career is going to be playing football. You know, so I didn't know if I was ever going to play at the college level or not, but I was really excited about the possibility of doing that. So when I started getting recruited and realized, gosh, I may have a chance to go get a college education and play football, I was all for it if I could figure out a way to get it done.
And, you know, one of the great things that I love about these conversations is learning everybody's journey, their path. You rarely find somebody who, as a third grader, says, this is what I'm going to do, and then that's exactly how it plays out. But we all get to wherever it is in one way or another. So here's my question for you, Kenny. When you're a 5'11", 165-pound ninth grader, at that point in time, could you have projected yourself to ultimately playing SEC football as a linebacker and then becoming a trial lawyer, successful one at that, for your career? Or at that time, did you think you'd be the second baseman for the Braves or some other career path?
Well, at that point in time, I thought that, you know, I just needed to make it through high school. Nobody in my family had ever been to college before.
Oh, wow.
And so it was not a given in my family that I was even going to go to college.
Mm-hmm.
But I was a straight A student, and my parents always told me, you know, they never did anything to make me that way. It was just in my nature to want to do well academically in school. And so, you know, Bernard, for me, it was just one of those deals where, you know, the academics were there because I wanted to learn. I enjoyed learning. And the athletics came together for me during my high school years. I mean, I was a decent baseball player, you know, back when I was growing up as a kid. But until I got into the 9th grade and started playing football, I had no idea what it was about. I had no idea if I could do it. But here's what I learned, and it started as a freshman. I learned that I loved football. I liked playing baseball, but I loved playing football. And I just really, really enjoyed it. And even though it was such hard work, and, you know, of course, back in those days, you know, they didn't give you water during practice, and they ran you to death. And, you know, everybody wanted to be like Bear Bryant at you know, Texas A&M and how he treated those kids out there. And that's what all the high school coaches thought they needed to be like back in those days. And they made you eat salt tablets all the time. So they were doing everything the wrong way in terms of those types of health issues. And it was difficult, but I mean, I just learned that I really loved it. I loved my teammates. I wanted to be with them. I wanted to be on the field fighting with them. And so, you know, as I went on in high school, you know, I realized the guys, the relationships and the friendships I was making in high school were really, really good friendships and relationships with those guys. And I was really excited as high school was coming to an end And I began to realize, hey, I'm going to have a chance to go do this some more. So I was really excited about that possibility, and just had to figure out, okay, which school am I going to end up going and playing for?
Well, Kenny, I'm a couple years younger than you. I grew up in Dothan, South Alabama, and I don't think you could get away with this today, like a lot of things you could back in the day. But we had a coach who would carry a bottle of salt tablets in his pocket, and throughout practice, he was pulling them out, and with his nasty hands, he'd hand it to you and say, swallow that. And you didn't question what your coaches were telling you, particularly if your dad was also doing that at home. But could you imagine them going around today and doing something like that?
Well, and at Decatur High School, the coaches every Friday afternoon before we went home and then had to come back for the Friday night game, before we went home, we had to go through the piss and vinegar ritual. And piss and vinegar was a little bitty Dixie cup that they would fill about halfway up with salt. And then they would pour Gatorade on top of it, and you had to drink that before you went home. And they stood there with a hose so you could wash it down with a hose. And they thought that was good for us.
Oh my
so
God.
I'm just glad I lived through that.
No kidding. No kidding. But speaking of friendships, are you still in contact with any of your Decatur classmates or teammates? Do you still have any of those friendships?
Yeah. Growing up, I had 3 sisters, so I didn't have any brothers. And so 2 of the guys that I went to high school with remain my best friends today. A guy named Bryce McCreelis, another guy named James McCravey. And Bryce is still in Decatur. James lives over in Athens, Alabama. And, those 2 guys, I know any day I can call them up and say, I need help on something. And, they're going to be there for me. And if they called me, I'd be there for them. So, yeah. And there's other guys other than that, but those are the 2 that I'm still closest with.
It's one of the things I've always cherished about sports, team sports, is those camaraderies, those friendships for life. And I too have 3 or 4 buddies I played all sports with, grew up with. They would come up to Nashville. They went to Auburn and Alabama respectively, but didn't play sports in college. But they would come up for the games, or they'd meet, wherever we were playing in the Southeast. And you're right. You could go weeks and months without picking up the phone or talking to them. But as soon as you do, you pick right back up wherever it is. And isn't it amazing how those stories just the ones that keep being retold, how they keep getting a little bit more embellished each time as our memory seems to remember it a little bit different.
I'm a trial lawyer, so I'm never going to admit that I embellish anything.
That's right. Well, Kenny, let's take it to your junior and senior years at Decatur. By now, you're on the radar of colleges, and were you starting to get questionnaires or phone calls, feelers, or your coaches at Decatur letting you know that colleges were starting to be interested?
Yeah, and it started a little bit in my junior year and then a whole lot in my senior year. And most of the people that were interested in me were smaller schools, like University of North Alabama. Of course, back then it was Florence State,
Right.
Troy University.
Mm-hmm.
And so some of those smaller schools, and it was mainly because, I was playing nose man, but I only weighed 185 pounds.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of schools had not looked at me with the goal in mind of making me a linebacker. And so, as a defensive lineman, I was a little guy, particularly compared to fellows like Frank Warren and Byron Brack.
Right.
But in my senior year is when Vanderbilt started talking to me. Dave Noose, the linebacker coach, had come up to Decatur. He apparently had talked with Coach Webb, and Coach Webb had told him, you ought to look at Kenny. And he came up, and he told me later that he was watching practice that day, and in the middle of practice, we had our only water break, and you got a little bitty Coke bottle full of water. And one of the guys on the team, actually, it's a guy whose name you'll know, a guy named Benny Perrin. Benny ended up playing at Alabama.
Sure.
And Benny grabbed 2 bottles of water that day. And I jumped on him. And Benny was a year younger than me. And I jumped on him and said, put that water back. That's for somebody else. And you can't take 2 of them. And Dave News happened to see that happen. And he told me later that that's why he became really interested in me, because he saw me, as somebody that was willing to step up and be a leader when necessary, as well as somebody that he thought he could turn into a linebacker. So anyway, that's when it happened. And actually, Bernard, I guess, the 2 schools that it kind of came down to for me, and this will make sense given, the background of me being an Army brat growing up, it came down to either West Point or Vanderbilt. And so West Point had told me that if I wanted to come to West Point, they would make sure, because you have to get a senator or a congressman to give you an appointment. And so, they were going to make sure that I got one of those appointments and could come to West Point. And they also wanted me to come up there and play linebacker at West Point. And then, of course, Coach Noose and Vanderbilt wanted me there. And so, my dad was retired from the Army. And I sat down and talked with him about it. And Dad said, look, Ken, you've got an opportunity to go to West Point or Vanderbilt. You're going to get a great education at either one of them. And he said, here's what I think you need to think about. If you want to make the Army your career, if you know that's what you want, then go to West Point. But if you're not absolutely 100% positive that you want to make the military your career, then you've got a chance to go play in the SEC at Vanderbilt, get a wonderful education, and some other kid who wants to make the military his career can end up going to West Point. And that's how I ended up making that decision, because I really liked both schools, but I decided, I'm going to go to Vanderbilt. I'm going to play in the SEC, and I'm going to let some other kid who wants to make the military his career, take that spot at West Point. And and the other thing was that I was afraid if I got up to West Point and some of those upperclassmen got in my face too badly, I'd end up punching some upperclassmen and end up getting kicked out of West Point and embarrassing my family. So,
Well, that thought or possibility aside, what a beautiful situation that you had. And I know you've probably thought about this many, many times, but with your dad having already gone through West Point and his Army experience, having that resource right there and it being your dad, gosh, that must have just really helped out things, or at least in my eye, the way I hear it.
Yeah.
Plus,
And let me correct this. Dad didn't go to West Point. My dad actually was a high school dropout. He dropped out of high school in Birmingham because the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor. And so he actually ended up joining the Marines and spending World War II out in the Pacific. His parents had to sign for him to join up with the Marine Corps. He was too young.
How old was he when he entered the military?
He was 17.
Wow.
And his parents signed for him, and he had quit high school and joined up with the Marine Corps and ended up being what's called a paramarine back in those days, which were Marines, the infantry, but they had been taught how to jump out of airplanes with parachutes. And so he spent World War II out in the Pacific. And then when he came back from World War II, he got out, was a civilian for a while, and then ended up going back into the Army. So he actually retired from the Army.
Wow.
But I was scared a little about choosing Vanderbilt, to be honest with you, until that day I talked with Dad about it, and that's what he had to say, because I knew that in his heart of hearts, my dad probably would have liked to have seen me go to West Point. But that's the way my dad was. He did not want to push me in a particular direction. He wanted me to be able to figure out my own path.
Well, one of the other things I was thinking about with Decatur's only maybe 3 hours 2.5 to 3 hours from Nashville. That may have been a helping deciding factor as well. Did you go on a recruiting trip up to Nashville?
I did. I went up my senior year during our football season, and went up for Vanderbilt's homecoming game. Mm-hmm. And I'll mention some names you may know. There's a young man named Thomas Woodruff from Athens, Alabama. And Thomas was a year older than me. He and I had played against each other in high school. And so he was the guy that was going to take me out on the recruiting trip when I was up there that weekend. And one of his friends that was at Vanderbilt, her sister was coming in that weekend to be there for the homecoming weekend. And that's a young lady, her name back then was Amanda Cunningham. It's now Amanda Farnsworth. And I saw where you posted an article about Amanda because her father, Jim Cunningham, played on the 1955 bowl team that Vanderbilt had.
Right.
So anyway, I went up there for the homecoming game at Vanderbilt, and Thomas Woodruff took me out and showed me around, and just had a wonderful time. Met Amanda, and of course she was going to be coming in as a freshman that next year as well. So Amanda and I have been friends, since we were seniors in high school, and went through Vanderbilt together. And of course, I've watched Amanda graduate from Vanderbilt and start her own business. She was in all that computer science stuff that wasn't any way I was going to get anywhere close to those classrooms. And of course, she ended up, having her own company and just, having phenomenal success. And so, but it was neat. Because my relationship with Vanderbilt people started, when I was, senior in high school and first started meeting folks.
And did that recruiting visit kind of seal the deal for you? Did that convince you that that's where you were going to go?
Yeah, it really did. And I just had a wonderful time at the ball game. My parents were up there with me. And actually my sister and her husband went up there on the trip as well. So it was a kind of a family affair, and it was a lot of fun. It was exciting. And, it just was something where I thought, well, this is where I feel really comfortable. And of course, and I knew I could get a good education there, and that was always important to me. So yeah, that was pretty much when I decided I'm going to Vanderbilt. Of course, that was assuming they were going to make me the offer. But
right. Well, that's what I was going to ask you. You get the offer at some point, but do you remember the conversation with any of the coaching staff saying, I'm committed, I'm coming, I want to sign with you guys? Do you remember any of those conversations?
Yeah, and it actually it occurred that same weekend. I didn't know that was going to happen, but before I left Nashville that weekend, Coach News had pulled me aside, and he said, Kenny, we want you to be a part of the Vanderbilt football program, and you go back home, talk to your folks about it, and you can let me know what you want to do, but we've got a spot for you. And so I was, of course, just as excited as I could be, and
I'm sure.
Went home and my mom and dad and I talked about it, and of course that's it was during that time frame that Dad had that conversation with me about West Point versus Vanderbilt, and it pretty much, and I think was just my dad's way of making it an easier decision for me, because I think he saw in me that that's where I wanted to be.
Just as a side note, Kenny, during the time when you were at Vanderbilt, did y'all ever play at Army at West Point?
No, we never did. We did play Air Force though. Played Air Force my sophomore year, and that was actually the game. Frank Mordica was our tailback, and Frank ran for over 321 yards and 5 touchdowns in that game. So that was just phenomenal.
It's like a career game. It was a whole career in a game. But the reason why I bring up West Point is I was fortunate enough, I think maybe my junior, I can't remember which year, it was junior, senior year, we went to West Point. And it's the most gorgeous campus. And that football stadium oversits the mouth of the Hudson River. It is just a phenomenal just from an aesthetics or visual standpoint. But
lot of history, a lot of history.
Take us to now the summer of you going to Vanderbilt for your freshman year. Did you come in that summer? Did you wait until the preseason camp? When did you first make your move up to Vanderbilt? And tell us a little bit about your roommate's assignment your freshman year.
Well, we reported August, I believe it was August the 19th that we reported for training. And they didn't, at that point in time, they didn't have people up there during the summertime working out and being there year round like ball players do nowadays. So I showed up in, basically the middle of August. And at that point in time, and I don't know if it existed when you were there, but Kassam Quadrangle was where they put a bunch of the freshman football players. And I was in Kassam dorm at Kassam Quadrangle, and was fortunate enough to get a room by myself.
Oh,
and
wow.
So I got to be in a solo room and didn't have to put up with another big old smelly guy in my room.
When I came through, my freshman fall was 86. And at that point, they had moved the freshman football players that we lived on the same floor as regular students, but we were in the Branscombe Quadrangle, near Memorial Gymnasium. And we lived in Lupton, which is the hall that, faced the front street. But I know that different people who I've talked to had different experiences their freshman year. Now, my final 3 years, we lived in Carmichael Towers. May they rest in peace. But did you guys, is that where y'all eventually went over to?
Yeah. Freshman year at Kassam, and then the other 3 years I was in Tower 2, Carmichael Tower 2, in room 323. So that was my room all 3 years.
Wow, isn't that great? You still remember that? I remember I was on the 8th floor. I don't remember the room numbers.
Yeah.
But
I'll tell you a funny story. When I was a freshman, you mentioned being on floors with other students. Yeah. And we had other students, non-ball players that were in the dorms with us. And the guy in the room next door to me was in the engineering school. Very, very smart guy. One of those guys that's really highly intelligent. And he loved playing the saxophone. Well, I'm trying to sleep because I'm tired, because we're going through 3-a-day practices and I'm worn out. And so at nighttime, I'm trying to get to sleep. Well, he would quit studying at, 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, and then he'd get his saxophone out and start playing his saxophone. Yeah. And so I finally had to just have a talk with him and say, look, we got to do something about this saxophone if you and I are going to get along. Yeah. So he ended up, there was a grass field out behind that quadrangle. And so he was nice enough to go out in the field and play his saxophone out there from that day on. But
I suspect it probably only took one conversation from you to convince him that he needed to take his music elsewhere. That's funny. It's these kind of conversations always jog different memories for me as we're going through them. And say what you want about other people who didn't attend Vanderbilt, who just have bad things or nasty things to say. You're an SEC football player, so you're not a small guy. You're a big guy, and the average student is much, much smaller. But sometimes on your freshman hall, they want to act like they want to test you. And this didn't happen to me, but it certainly happened to a couple of the linemen, and it didn't take very long. And why they chose to wrestle, see if they could pin the football players, it just doesn't make sense. I mean, what are you thinking? And maybe it was alcohol flowing or something, but I just remember those times.
Might have something to do with it.
Yeah, there had to have been something there.
One of the things that struck me my freshman year, because I enjoyed being there, and I'd grown up, like I said, an Army brat, moved around a lot, and so I was used to making new friends in new places all the time. So, being up at Vanderbilt and making new friends was not really an issue with me. But what I did experience was that a lot of the students thought that since I was a football player, therefore I must not be that smart.
Mm-hmm.
And, what ended up happening was that, because like I said, academics were always important to me, and I studied hard. I wanted to do well. And, as time went on my freshman year, and I got to know those other, students, the non-football player students, they began to realize, Kenny's, he's not that dumb after all. And so as the year wore on, I would be studying for the next exam and whatever the class might be. And, of course, a lot of the classes that we all took as freshmen were the same classes, even though you might be in, arts and science, or you might be in engineering, but we had to take some of those same classes. And so what I ended up seeing was that a lot of those students would start knocking on my door, and they'd say, "Hey, Cole, can you help me with this concept? I'm not really understanding this." And so, that was something where I really enjoyed. It was kind of fulfilling to know that, they recognized that I could handle the academic part of it as well. But it was also an opportunity to build relationships with people that weren't on the football team.
And it wasn't just the students that recognized it. For those of you who don't know, Kenny was also named All-Academic SEC your senior year, your junior year, or both?
It was actually my sophomore year.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah. And then, and you may not remember this, but I blew out my L5-S1 disc in my lower back during the summer before my junior year. And so I didn't get to play junior or senior years. I was still on the team. They moved me to what they called a medical scholarship so I could finish school. But because I'd blown out that L5-S1 disc, I wasn't actually able to play as a junior and senior. So my sophomore year was when I made the academic All-SEC.
Gotcha. Well, thank you for correcting me on that. Kenny, let's go on to the field.
Okay.
We're at Vanderbilt. You're getting dressed out. You're with SEC school. There's some well-established players on both sides of the ball on the roster. You, with a whole bunch of other new guys, are coming onto the team in the fall of '77. And to a man, when I asked this question, they all remember it. What was that moment that said to you, I'm playing some big boy football right now. I'm not in Decatur. I'm not at home. This is not high school. This is the real deal. So I know you've got to have that moment that I want you to share.
Yeah. The moment I realized it was when we came in as freshmen. At first, it was just freshmen. The older guys weren't there for about the first 3 days. So they were kind of breaking the freshmen in, letting us get to know each other. And then the upperclassmen showed up. The first day that we went on the field, they threw a freshman defense together and threw us out there against the varsity offense, the starters.
Some pretty decent offensive players at that time, too.
They had some good ones, and there was an offensive lineman who was a senior that year, and his name was Mike Birdsong. And Mike Birdsong was perhaps the largest person I had ever met up until that point in my life. And I had to go up against him in practice. And I looked at him because my dad was in the Army, I started school in England, and I started when I was 5. So I was a year younger than everybody else in my class. So I'm 17 years old as a freshman. And I'm looking across the line at Mike Birdsong. I weigh 185 pounds. Birdsong was about 265, 270. And he had a full beard. He was a man.
He was at least 4 years older than you.
He was. And I felt like a child trying to go up against that guy. And he ate my lunch. And I thought, man, this is going to be a long day today. So it was. And I'll tell you another guy that was on that team. He was on the defensive side, but he was another guy that made you realize you were playing SEC football, and that was Dennis Harrison. Dennis played defensive end. He was a senior that year, and Dennis was 6'7", and weighed about 285. I mean, just a monster of a man. But he was a full-grown fella.
And for those of you who don't know who he was, I'm sure you do. He ended up playing with the Eagles and maybe one or two other teams. Had a very productive NFL career. I got to meet him a few times in the locker room and just on the at Magoogan. One of the nicest guys you'd ever come around, but a heck of a football player.
And Mike Birdsong also. He and Dennis both just the nicest guys in the world. But they were full-grown men, and I realized when I saw them that I was in a situation where I was going to have to grow up real fast.
Well, Kenny, I had the pleasure my freshman year of running the scout team at quarterback, and I had the even better pleasure of having Chris Gaines, all SEC middle linebacker, 7 feet right in front of me, looking me dead in the eyes with that look that he had. And for those of you who, I know all of you here know who Chris was. Chris, he probably still has the SEC record, maybe even close to one of the national records. He had 37 tackles in one game against Tulane, I think in '87. I mean, that guy tackled everything. But Chris was my introduction. His younger brother, Brad, was in my recruiting class, but Chris was my introduction to SEC football.
Yeah.
So we all had that moment. We all remember that moment. But clearly,
I'll tell you this. As freshmen, we came in and there were a couple of guys that I got to be pretty close friends with right off the bat. One of them was a defensive tackle. It's a black guy from Chicago, Illinois. His name's Rod Gurley. And Rod and I hit it off really, really well. I mean, he was a giant defensive tackle from Chicago, and I'm a little bitty middle linebacker from Decatur, Alabama. He's a black guy, I'm a white guy, but Rod and I became really close friends early on in our careers at Vanderbilt. And there was another linebacker by the name of Phil Swindoll. And Phil and I became good friends. Now, at the beginning, we were not friends because we were, we thought we were competing against each other for a, starting position on the varsity because we both wanted to be on the varsity. So Phil and I ended up getting in a lot of fights with each other at the beginning, but we eventually worked it out and got to be friends. But Rod and Phil and I were all on that scout team having to go up against the varsity offense. And there was a guy named Tom Galbeers who had played. He was an all-SEC noseman on Vanderbilt's defense several years before we got there. He had played on the last bowl team that they had when they played in the Peach Bowl. And so Galbeers was our freshman coach and, defensive coach. And so Galbeers, he was encouraging us to get after that offense, and buddy, we got after him. And so Phil and Rod and I were in the middle of quite a few scraps with the offensive guys during that first fall practice. But that was something that I think, the offensive guys might not have liked us a whole lot, but they respected us because they knew that we weren't going to back down and that we would be good teammates to them as time went on.
And making them better. One of the unique things about a school and a program like Vanderbilt, and it still goes on today, is they can't just recruit regionally. They can't pull a lot of kids out of just the Tennessee area or, Kentucky, Alabama. They can't do that. They have to go nationwide. You mentioned Gurley out of Chicago. In my recruiting class, we peppered the entire United States. And I know that if you look at all of the recruiting classes in the last 20, 30 years or even further back, kids are from all over the place because Vanderbilt has to with its academic standards, as well as you just have to find that right personality. So here's my question, Kenny. In your recruiting class in '77, did you have kids not only from the South or from what I'll call the SEC footprint, but were there other kids, other ball players like Gurley from other parts of the country?
I remember we had a kid named Jeff Swab, and Swabby was from, I think I'm remembering this right, Swabby was from California. And he was, remember the movie, Remember the Titans, where they had Sunshine? and from California, had the long blonde hair.
Mm-hmm.
That's what Jeff Schwab looked like back in those days. So he was from California. Gurley was from Chicago. Gosh, I'm trying to think. Seems like there were some other guys that were from, other areas of the country, but I'm drawing a blank right now.
Well, it's while you're thinking about that, one of the experiences that really opened my eyes was the guys from different parts of the country, particularly up north, weren't used to the humidity in the South. And those guys, they could be world-class sprinters, wide receivers, the specialty guys who are in great shape and run really fast 40s, but they didn't know how to calibrate or to adjust. When we would have to come into camp running a mile and a half, depending on your weight and your position, under a certain time period. And I would always, I'm luck of the draw, I could get it within 2 seconds of under what I needed, just because I guess I figured out with the humidity and growing up in the South. But we had guys, wide receivers, DBs, who could run for days, but that humidity struck them. It just took the life out of them. And I always learned that those guys from up north just had not been used to that humidity.
Yeah, I think that's right. I know, Gurley didn't like it a whole lot when he was down there in August, and we'd stand right inside the door as we were about to go on to the practice field, and with those doors open to the practice field, you could just feel that heat and humidity rolling through the doorway and hit you in the face. And of course, we had those black helmets on, and somebody in the group every day would say, "It's going to be another hot day for the black hat." And then we'd run out onto the field for practice.
Now,
it was brutal out there.
Did the stadium have grass, or had they already converted to turf while you were there?
They called it turf. I'm not real sure that's what it was or not.
It was more like
indoor,
outdoor, on top of cement.
Yeah, it was very thin and very hard, and the star that was painted on the middle of the field at that point in time had so many layers of paint on it that it had gotten taller than the rest of the turf, and there were all kinds of sharp points of paint all on top of each other. And if you tackled somebody on that star, you were in a world of hurt because you were going to leave some of your skin on the star.
Well, I have no doubt, because I know of one story. Everett Crawford out of Huntsville, a great running back, wide receiver, hybrid player. He was a couple years ahead of me. They were practicing on the turf, and if you recall, that turf has seams where it's sewn together every 5 or 10 yards.
Right.
The seam had come up. Everett, I believe the story is that he caught his foot and ended up blowing out his knee on that horrible, horrible carpet of a stadium flooring. But anyway, let's go on to the field. I want you to tell me a little bit about some of your experiences, whether they're in practice, in games, just being around the guys. What were some good memories that you got? And I'm not going to let you get out of here without telling us some campus life stories as well.
Well, I'll tell you, my sophomore season, my freshman season, our first game of the season was against Oklahoma. At that point in time, Oklahoma was rated #1 in the country. And we had a linebacker by the name of Ed Smith. He was the starting middle linebacker. And Ed had a fantastic game against Oklahoma. He made, I think, 15 or 16, 18 tackles, something that was just a phenomenal number. And we almost beat Oklahoma. And that was played at Oklahoma. So that was an exciting experience for everybody. Then, the rest of that season just did not go well. I mean, it did not go well. We didn't win a lot of ball games. And then, we rolled around to my sophomore year, and I'll have to tell you this one. My sophomore year, I mentioned Phil Swindoll to you earlier. Well, Swindoll and I are out there on the field against Ole Miss. and the game's being played at Vanderbilt. And so we're out there on the field, and they hand the ball to Ole Miss's tailback. And Phil and I came up into the hole. We were both playing linebacker. We hit the tailback, we tackle him. And as we were taking him to the turf, all the linemen ended up piling up on top of us. There was a big pile of flesh. And I can hear the tailback for Ole Miss, and he is screaming at the bottom of this pile. This guy is in mortal pain. And I'm yelling, get up, he's hurt. So all these big guys start getting up off of us. And finally, Phil and I can get up. And I look down, and I'm expecting the tailback's going to have his hip out of joint or something horrible. And as Phil and I jump up, the tailback for Ole Miss jumps up, and he runs on back to his offensive huddle. And I'm like, what's going on? So I go back to our defensive huddle, and old Phil's standing there. He's got his hands on his knees, and he's laughing. And I looked at him, and I said, Phil, what'd you do that guy? And he said, Cole, when we tackled him, my chin strap came loose, and my helmet rode up, and his leg was laying in front of me, and I was chewing on his leg. And so whoever that tailback was for Ole Miss, he can now know that it was Phil Swindoll chewing on his leg that day.
Oh, man. The stuff that you could get away with back then that today would be on social media in a heartbeat. 100.
Well, and let me tell you,
Yeah.
Speaking of things that would be on ESPN in a heartbeat, that same game, and I'm not making this up, that same game, our offense is out on the field. And so Phil and I are standing on the sideline watching our offense, and our quarterback dropped back. The offense was on the far side, over close to Ole Miss's sideline. So our quarterback drops back, and he flings a pass downfield, and a defensive back for Ole Miss intercepted the ball, and he's coming down our sideline, and there is nothing but green grass. And it's going to be a pick six of about 75 yards. And of course, our offense is trying to run across the field and get to him. Guys, the receivers are chasing him from behind. All the referees are running down the field, and they're all looking out onto the field to make sure nobody's clipping anybody. Nobody's watching the guy with the ball. And Phil and I are standing there on the sideline, and all of a sudden Swindoll throws his helmet on and starts buckling up. And I had enough time to look at him and say, what are you doing? And he came off the sideline as that defensive back came by, and he ear-holed him right there on the sideline and took him down. And everybody on our sideline just collectively took our breath in, and I yelled, get him off the field. And we all went out on the field, and the guys behind me grabbed him by the ankles and pulled him off the field. The referees did not see it, Bernard. Now, the entire Ole Miss crowd saw it. The entire Ole Miss football team saw it. But back then, nobody had replay. And so the referees didn't see it. So it was 1st and 10 Ole Miss right there where Phil had tackled the guy. Now, here's the funny thing. One of the coaches for Ole Miss that year was Coach Macintyre. And at the end of that season, Coach Pancoast was released, and Vanderbilt hired Coach Macintyre to come in as our new head coach. And so we're in the first team meeting. Everybody's gathered, offense and defense, and Coach Mack is going to come in, and he's going to talk to the football team for the first time. And Coach Mack walks in. There was a dais up there in the front of the room, and he steps up on the dais, and he looks out over the crowd. And Phil and I were sitting next to each other there. And Coach Mack says, would Phil Swindoll please stand up? And old Swindoll hung his head, but he stood up and said, I'm here, Coach, like that. And Coach Mack, of course, knew that Phil was the one who had tackled that guy on the sideline. And Coach Mack looked at him and said, Swindoll, I'm going to be watching you. he said, "You can sit down now." So Phil sat back down, but Swindoll, he thought he was in serious trouble from the very beginning.
Were you guys ever able to watch that replay, maybe in the game films or at any point?
We saw it on the game films, yeah. On that Sunday after the ball game. And I mean, if ESPN had existed back then, that would have been on ESPN. Everybody would have been talking about it. And with today's rules and everything, instant replay would have had it. Phil would have been thrown out of the ball game. All those types of things, because not only was he coming off the sideline, but it was definitely head-to-head contact. Of course, back then they didn't care.
Only that famous Tommy Lewis Alabama play tackled the Rice running back. That's the only other one of those situations that I've ever heard. Oh my gosh, what a story!
Phil Swindoll did that for Vanderbilt in 1978 against Ole Miss, and he probably is going to be mad at me for telling that story, because he probably has never admitted that to his children.
Well, I don't know if he's part of our Facebook group, but he's got to watch this interview somehow. But, well, Kenny, I want you to share with me, what were some of your favorite hangout spots on and off campus? Where'd you go eat? Where'd you let your hair down a little bit? I know over the years, the campus has changed so much. And the metro area and that midtown part of the campus, I know you've been up there in the last few years, but even from our time when I was there in the late 80s, what a huge difference. But some of those places are still around.
Yeah. Well, my dad had a bunch of cousins in Nashville. So from the 1930s on, my dad knew about the Elliston Place soda shop. And so one of the things that I love doing is walking across West End and walking over to 21st Avenue, Elliston Place was the name of the street there, not 21st, Elliston Place. And I don't know if it was, I guess it's still there today. I think it is.
I don't know, it might be. I'm not sure.
But it was the Elliston Place soda shop was one of those places that had the little jukeboxes in the booths where you could put a dime in them and play the songs you wanted to listen to. And it had the stools there at the soda jerk fountain where they would make make milkshakes the old-fashioned way. And I think some of the ladies that worked there when I was in school probably worked there in the 1930s when my dad was going there as a child. So Elliston Place Soda Shop was one of the places I loved going to. There was a restaurant over there called Houston's, also on Elliston Place. I remember going there because for me, it was an expensive place to go. But I dated a young lady at Vanderbilt, and when her mom would come into town, she could afford to take us out to fancy places and eat big meals. And so we would go to Houston's a lot of times. And I can remember going in there and telling the waitress one time that I wanted 2 of the hamburger plates that they had. And she looked at me kind of funny and she said, "You mean you want like 2 hamburgers on a plate?" And I said, "No, ma'am, I want 2 orders with French fries and everything." And she said, "Oh, okay, so you want one of them now and one of them to go?" And I said, "No, ma'am, I just want 2 plates. This is not difficult. I want 2 plates with 2 burgers and 2 orders of fries and 2 orders of fixings." And she didn't really trust me on it, but she brought it to me and I ate it all. So, I was hungry back in those days.
Right.
And there was also, there were some places, of course, on, weekend nights and whatever that we would go out and all the students would hang out at. I don't know if they were there when you were there. There was a place called Waxy's that was a drinking hole type establishment that a lot of the students would go to. And the bartender at that place was a guy named Jonesy. And Jonesy ended up starting his own place, and it was called Jonesy's. And it was over, remember where the Holiday Inn is? And there used to be I think it's maybe still there, a parking lot back behind the Holiday Inn. And Jonesy's was a little building that's not there anymore, but it was right there on that street that runs right by the Holiday Inn.
I remember visiting there. Absolutely. What about Rotiers? Did you ever go to Rotiers?
Yeah. And actually, not too many years ago, we had a law school reunion, and that was one of the places that I introduced Jill to. She had never been to Rotiers before, and so I introduced her to Rotiers at that law school reunion. And we realized that the food there is still not any healthier than it was in 1977.
Right.
But it sure is good.
Especially if you lived in the towers and it was late at night and you had a couple bucks and wanted a greasy burger or something like that, that's where you went. It's still there and it's still doing their thing.
Hey, I'll tell you something. I don't think anybody else at Vanderbilt can tell you this story. My junior year, there were a whole bunch of us that were together one night, and it had been a night where everybody, I'm sure, was just up studying until the early morning hours, until about 5 o'clock in the morning. And after everybody, finished their studying at about 5 o'clock in the morning, somebody said, "Did y'all know that Mary Ann lives in Nashville?" And we said, "What are you talking about? Mary Ann lives in Nashville." And he said, "Mary Ann from Gilligan's Island." And he was talking about Dawn Wells, the actress that played Mary Ann on Gilligan's Island. And we were like, "No way." And he said, "Yeah, she lives in Nashville now. And she lives over," and he named some neighborhood down West End and to the left. I don't know what that neighborhood is, but it's a nice neighborhood. And so he convinced all of us that Mary Ann from Gilligan's Island lived in that neighborhood. So we all jump in a car and decide we're going to go find Mary Ann. And so we headed down West End, got down, turned left, and I don't know how anybody knew where to look, but we're driving through this neighborhood trying to find Mary Ann from Gilligan's Island. And I'm laughing because I know that this is ridiculous. It's not even true. And we're never going to find Mary Ann from Gilligan's Island. And Bernard, I'm telling you the truth. We're driving down this street and a lady in a blue house robe with ruffles around the sleeves is walking out her driveway to the street to get the Saturday morning newspaper. This is during the spring, right? And she's getting her Saturday morning newspaper, and it is Dawn Wells, Mary Ann from Gilligan's Island in the flesh. And we stopped. We couldn't believe it. And we stopped and rolled down the windows and said, "You're Mary Ann from Gilligan's Island." And she started laughing and said, "Well, yes, I am." And we told her, "Man, we've been driving around for about 2 hours trying to find your home in this neighborhood because we were all in love with you while we were in high school." And she got the biggest kick out of that. And we talked to her for a little while. And then fortunately, we were smart enough to roll up the windows and leave and get back to campus. But we actually met Mary Ann from Gilligan's Island.
Well, if you're going away from town on West End and eventually turn left to the neighborhood, you might have been in Belmead.
That's it. It was Belmead. Yeah, it was back there in Belmead.
Belmead is just beyond. It's the next neighborhood past campus. And that's probably one of the more ritzy or more Tony neighborhoods in all of Nashville.
Yeah, because it was a bunch of fine-looking houses back there. And I thought about whether or not I even wanted to tell you that story because I didn't know if anybody would believe me.
Oh, I believe.
But I Googled it. I Googled Dawn Wells yesterday. And she actually, I can confirm to you that she did actually live in Nashville during the late 1970s. So I'm not lying about that.
That's awesome.
That's a true story.
Well, Kenny, time has flown. We're well over an hour, and I could keep talking to you forever, but I sure appreciate you sharing some of your memories and telling us your story. And it's just a lot of fun for me tonight.
Well, I appreciate it. I've enjoyed talking with you, Bernard, and I hope that some of these stories at least will put a smile on somebody else's face.
Oh, I know they will. I know they will. Well, guys, as we try to every Thursday night, is conversations with Commodores and Decatur. Uh, Decatur, not born, but raised, and now Huntsville attorney Kenny Cole, who played in the late 70s for Vanderbilt under Coaches Pancoast, and then later Coach Mack, I think maybe your senior year
Yeah.
came on. But what a wonderful conversation. So thank you again, Kenny.
Absolutely. Absolutely enjoyed it, Bernard.
Thank you. And guys, as we try to each week, I'll see you next Thursday. Hopefully this time the internet will be cooperating, and that'll do it for tonight. Thank you.